Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that many of the delegates that ended up at the Constitutional Convention first met in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to revise the Articles of Confederation, prior to meeting again the following year in 1787 in Philadelphia? That Thomas Jefferson was so upset with Alexander Hamilton and George Washington over Hamilton's bold plan for the National Bank, among other things, that he quit Washington's cabinet to begin to prepare for his own run for president. And that President John Adams' most proud decision in his entire political career was to keep the U.S. out of war with France, all the while sticking it to Alexander Hamilton. Did you remember all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because we will review that and more in episode 108, Unit 4 Review, Part 1. Because, let's not pretend like we actually remember all of this stuff. All right, everyone, welcome into Unit 4 Review, Part 1. I'm diving into what we've covered basically the last 45 episodes. And as you can imagine, a review of 45 episodes is a lot of content. So I'm breaking it up just like I did for the Unit 3 review into two parts here. And hopefully these reviews are giving you an opportunity to connect some dots that maybe you missed if you have been listening to these weekly, or you found the podcast later and you've been binging them. It's just so much content at one time. Ideally, in the end, my hope is that if you need a refresher on this stuff, you can check out the reviews. You can even, listen to the reviews, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, etc., back to back to back to catch up on everything, because I think it is important to have context over what's going on and where we are and how we got here. And, I've binge listened to narrative history podcasts before, and sometimes it all gets lost in the shuffle. So hopefully these are helpful. If they're not, I apologize for taking a couple weeks to do them, but, hopefully for most it is. We ended Unit 3 with the Revolutionary War, really the end of the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris. And Unit 4 began with us looking toward building a new nation. The birth of republicanism, the challenges that the Founding Fathers encountered, the growth of the young republic, and the entangled foreign diplomacy of our early years is what we're really going to be focusing on reviewing today. The calls for a Republican form of government began as soon as the shots were heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. And actually, you could say for some people, it started even before that. And what many of these young Americans, well, I should say colonists, really wanted to focus on was creating a system of government in which the power would be directly and, as we'll find out, indirectly derived from the people, in which and that's what we have today, right? Technically, all of our government officials, they work for the people. If they don't do their job well, the people can vote them out, or as we see today, you could even go to extreme measures as an impeachment process, etc. So there are safeguards in place, and essentially what I'm saying is that the people retain the ultimate power. What these colonists wanted was a government in which the people could define and limit the power of the government. Of course, now I'm using the word people and I'm using it pretty liberally because that's how we would use it today, but you have to keep in mind that people back then did not include everyone. The Constitution of New Jersey in 1776, the Constitution of New Jersey included women in the right to vote, saying that all adults, quote, worth 50 pounds had the right of suffrage. They didn't specify a gender, but that was it. In every other state, African Americans, women, and poor white men were not provided their opportunity to impact the government, right? Their opportunity to vote. And once you take away someone's opportunity to vote or right to vote, then you're limiting the representation in the government. You're blunting the buy-in and the passion people have for their country, and in every other way, right? That you're taking away their ability to make the government work for them. So while the spirit of 1776 pushed forth a narrative of inclusion and an empowered citizenry, the reality of it limited the power to wealthy, white, land-owning men. Of course, not everyone agreed that our political system should be constructed that way. And you'll be like, well, duh, yeah, poor whites, African Americans, women, and Native Americans definitely didn't agree. But and there were women who loudly pointed out the injustice of our system, and Abigail Adams being one of the most well-known. But many white men who did have money or did have land also recognized the incompatibility with slavery in a system that should be protecting the natural rights of the people. But while many, especially in the North, believed this deep down, few had the courage to actually say it, stand by it, or even, heck, demand it. As we move into Unit 5, we will see the emergence of such figures, and you will notice how much more of a fracture it creates in our national discourse and in our nation's unity. But with most Northern whites, even those that recognize the inherent contradiction in our Republican narrative, staying quiet and not wanting to, quote, rock the boat, the U.S. found itself developing an idea for government that excluded women, blacks, natives, and poor whites. Speaking of natives, we've touched on just how bad the war was for them. Following the Treaty of Paris, one British officer observed that, quote, the minds of these people, the natives, appear as much agitated as those of the unhappy loyalist. They have very seriously proposed to abandon their country and accompany us in an evacuation, having made all the world their enemies by their attachment to us. Although most states had their own constitutions, with some even including a Bill of Rights, once the war officially began and the Continental Congress gathered, there was a glaring need to create a national constitution that ensured the union of the states, something the colonies had failed to do following the Albany Conference during the French and Indian War, much to the chagrin of Benjamin Franklin. In November of 1777, the representatives agreed to the creation of the Articles of Confederation. This document stated that, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States, in Congress assembled. As you may remember, this created a loose confederation of autonomous states. While it seemed like a pretty big step in 1777, in retrospect, it fell way short of what the nation really needed, and not only effectively supply the army to fight the war that they were involved in, but also govern this burgeoning nation during the war and after. While the war was being fought, the imports to the United States dropped dramatically, as I'm sure you could assume, because our number one trading partner was the country we were currently at war with. This created a financial strain on many different colonies, but none suffered more than New England. Without the power to tax, which the Articles of Confederation did not give the federal government, the federal government was powerless to take hold of national issues, such as the economic crisis that was impacting its people. As the war was winding down, an economic bubble was building. Basically, what was happening was that following the war, Britain had closed its markets to American exports, but it was still willing to allow the U.S. to import British goods. This is after the war. I'll take a step back here. Britain had closed off its markets to American exports, but it was still trading British goods to America. So what was happening is American coastal merchants were buying these, and then they were selling them to inland merchants and farmers. But when they sold them to inland merchants, and when those merchants sold them to farmers, they were for the most part sold on credit, right? Promise to pay back, they'll take the goods, they'll make a profit off of them in whatever way, and then they'll pay it back. Well, this is where things became an issue, because eventually the British merchants were demanding specie, like hard coin, from the coastal merchants as the only form of payment, which created a domino effect of American merchants demanding this from the inland merchants demanding this from the farmers, and the only real coin in the nation at this time was left over from the French army, who had come over to America and spent money while they were there. But since the British market was still closed off to American exports, this specie dried up really quickly, because they're using it to buy things from Britain, but they're not really able to sell things back to Britain to get more money circulated into the American economy. And this left many Americans in an immense amount of debt with no practical way to pay it off, threatening their land, their families, and their livelihood. While I frame this in a hopefully digestible and reductionist way in order for us to easily understand it, naturally there were more moving pieces and nuanced complications depending on the circumstance. But overall the theme remained. The situation such as this, where the specie dried up, is what created situations like Shays' Rebellion in 1786, which I covered in episode 74. The rebellion shut down the courts and created a chaotic atmosphere, Shays' Rebellion, that is, which only strengthened the calls for a stronger national government in order to maintain civil order in the states. While the Articles were able to pass the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which were great, they laid the groundwork for westward expansion, the article still left a lot to be desired. These two things didn't really make up for all of its glaring weaknesses. The aforementioned civil strife from rebellions such as Shays' Rebellion, the inability to adequately handle foreign relations, and the failure to manage interstate trade forced the founders to reconsider their current form of government. Motivated by the failings of the Articles, many state delegates, led by James Madison, met in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to, quote, devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Agreeing that more work needed to be done than could with the limited delegates present in Annapolis, the men agreed to go home, think about it for a while, and gather again the following year in Philadelphia, which is exactly what they did. In May of 1787, 55 delegates arrived, with Rhode Island being the only holdout. Rhode Island wanted exclusive control over their trade, and they were afraid that a stronger, more effective national system may threaten that autonomy, which they would have been right, because it did. While many ardent supporters of the Articles of Confederation, such as Patrick Henry, who, when talking about the Constitutional Convention, said he, quote, smelled a rat, while many of these men refused to attend, those that were present were hoping to make some real progress in ensuring the effectiveness of our national government and safety and security of the American people. It became clear pretty quickly that the invitation was to amend the Articles, but some of the people throwing the party had a different idea entirely in mind. Taking Madison's lead, the Virginia representatives showed up early. They schemed and they planned. And they proposed an entirely new government in their creatively named Virginia Plan. This was soon countered by the New Jersey Plan, which more closely resembled the Articles of Confederation. After a couple months of debate, the men agreed on a compromise, often referred to as the Great Compromise. With names such as the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, the Great Compromise, you can tell that brand consultants did not exist in the 18th century, because they are the least creative names you could ever imagine. But the Great Compromise basically laid the groundwork for what we have today, for the most part. It called for the upper house, which today would be the Senate, to have equal representation for each state, and the lower house, which today is the House of Representatives, to be based on population. Additionally, the delegates also include the 3/5 compromise, which more or less said that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to both taxation and representation, a compromise between the North and the South. If you want a refresher on all this stuff and these compromises and the plans, check out episodes 76, 77, and 78. With this much agreed to, the delegates then spent another 2 months filling in the rest of the details, deciding on a couple issues that directly impacted slavery. The Southern delegates weren't happy about it, but eventually they agreed that only a simple majority was needed for trade regulations, instead of a 2/3 supermajority. Naturally, they were afraid that with the North growing in population more quickly and maybe new states in the North, that any trade regulations that only need a simple majority would somehow limit their slave-owning power. So this was a big concession on their part. In return, they were promised that the importation of slaves would be tabled for about another 20 years, and that if a slave escaped to the North, the state that the slave escaped to would have to return the slave. This little-known fugitive slave law that was included in our Constitution will become a much bigger deal in the years to come in our narrative, especially toward the end of Unit 5. Lastly, after some significant debate that included Alexander Hamilton reminding men like Thomas Jefferson that he really liked the idea of a monarchy and may have been a closeted monarchist, which is what Jefferson thought, the delegates settled on the idea of the president. This person would be able to serve unlimited 4-year terms and would be elected by an electoral college system which they created. While there were very good reasons for the electoral college at the time, at least in theory there were, it is something that only complicates our current politics and has caused quite a bit of national debate. But that's how it's written. And I don't see, for a lot of reasons, this changing anytime soon. In the end, the founders created a federal system of government, which means the power is shared between the national government and the states. It was clear, at least initially, that the legislature was the most powerful branch, followed by the executive and judicial branch a distant third. As you may remember, though, and something that Bill and I covered in episode 93, the court case of Marbury v. Madison greatly empowered the judicial branch, giving it the power of judicial review, and put it on much more equal footing with the other two. This new government, written after 4 months of hot, steamy debate in Philadelphia, was submitted to the states for ratification in September of 1787. Understanding that I may be oversimplifying it, most historians approach this debate as a debate between two primary groups, the Federalists, who were in favor of ratification, and the Anti-Federalists, who weren't. And this is all detailed in episode 79. The Federalists sought to curb the power of the states through a more powerful central government. They believed a large republic could best safeguard their freedoms and didn't think the Bill of Rights, at least initially, was required. The Anti-Federalists had many arguments against ratification, but they primarily centered around their fear of the power of a central government in supremacy to the states and didn't think this form of government could adequately protect the rights of the citizens. In order to ease those concerns, they demanded a detailed Bill of Rights. Eventually, the Federalists were able to win the day, and the Constitution was ratified with promises of a forthcoming Bill of Rights. Delaware was the first state to do so on December 7th, 1787, with the obstinate Rhode Islanders holding out all the way until May of 1790. Almost 2.5 years later. While the founders were still debating the details of the Constitution, one thing was pretty obvious. The first president was going to be George Washington. Washington was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789. He took over a nation with some growing sectional identities. The New England region was overwhelmingly of English descent, with about 80% of its population. The Mid-Atlantic region was far more diverse, with only 1/3 of the population being English. It includes significant numbers of Europeans, such as Germans, Dutch, Scottish, Irish, Scots-Irish, Welsh, and, of course, Africans, free and slave. These European lineages were all in the South too, but the primary groups to make up 2/3 of the Southern population were English and enslaved Africans, each making up roughly 1/3 of the population. Washington was tasked with governing these regions in the best way he could, while also overseeing an orderly and safe expansion into the West, knowing this would bring some significant issues with the Native Americans in these regions. Congress made quick work of beginning the debate on including a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They were ratified in December of 1791. And while the things were in motion to create these first 10 amendments to the Constitution, Congress also passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, creating the federal court system. The Congress made sure to take advantage of the power to raise revenue under this constitutional system, something they did not have in the Articles of Confederation. They passed the Tariff Act of 1789, which levied a duty of 5% on most imported goods, but imposed tariffs as high as 50% on a limited number of goods such as steel, salt, cloth, and tobacco. The most controversial action of Washington's first term came courtesy of one Mr. Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, proposed an incredibly bold strategy that would alleviate state debts, enhance American standing abroad, and increase the power and standing of the federal government over the states. Hamilton proposed a few different ideas. First, he said that the federal government should not only fund the national debt with new bonds, but also buy up the debt of each individual state. This would ensure that creditors had a stake in the good fortune and future of the national government, and also indirectly make the states indebted to the federal government. His second proposal called for an excise tax on whiskey, which would help pay down the debt and establish the power of the federal government to impose internal taxes. His third proposal, which was his boldest, was his plan to charter a national bank to control all of this money. The bank would be jointly owned by the federal government and private investors. It would serve as a fiscal and depository agent of the government and make loans to businesses. I go into a lot more detail on this plan in episode 82. In short, the proposal was incredibly bold and made a lot of people very angry. Many objected to this plan. Some of their arguments were as follows. This would reward creditors and speculators, something that they did not want to do. It would centralize money around the wealthy in the Northeast even more. It would create a permanent debt, tying the government directly to the moneyed interest and force future generations to be saddled with the consequences. And the states had varying debts, some owed more than others. So buying up all the states' debts with no real compromises seemed like a very unfair proposition to the states who had little or no debt from the war. A little taken aback by the ferocity of his opposition, Hamilton was eventually able to reach a compromise. Jefferson and Madison, two of his primary opponents, said they would rally Southern support, and in return, the capital would be moved temporarily from New York to Philadelphia for about a decade, while they plotted out a region along the Potomac River to permanently place it, which is, as you probably know, where Washington, D.C. is today. The fallout and controversy surrounding Hamilton's bold vision for the U.S. created a clear political divide. But it wasn't only Hamilton and his bank. The French Revolution was in high gear, and the Americans found themselves taking sides. Tensions were high in the U.S. with the Edmund Genet affair, which I covered in episode 83, and George Washington was determined to keep the U.S. neutral. In addition to tensions over the French Revolution, Washington had also sent John Jay to negotiate a diplomatic end to the British impressment of our ships and figure out something to solve their trade restrictions. This treaty, known as Jay's Treaty, furthered the divide in American politics. It was viewed by many to have not gone far enough and was too lenient and deferential to Britain. So with this political fracture in the United States, you have two parties that are formed from all of these events, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, who are often referred to casually during this period as the Republicans. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and tacitly supported through the actions of George Washington, even though technically he was not even bipartisan, he was just apolitical, supported the increased central authority of the government. It supported Hamilton's bank plan, were opposed to involvement in the French Revolution, and supported Jay's Treaty, even though they recognized it wasn't ideal. Democratic Republicans, led by men like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, took the opposite stances. They wanted to maintain state sovereignty, they opposed Hamilton's bank plan, They favored the French people in their revolutionary fight and had little to no desire to defer to Britain on much of anything. Hell, they just fought a war against this country. The political division only became more apparent with the approaching election of 1796, which I covered in episode 87. John Adams was the Federalist candidate, and he was opposed by Thomas Jefferson, who had become so frustrated with the Federalist-inspired decision-making by Hamilton and allowed by Washington that he had quit his cabinet post years earlier to prepare for this election. John Adams rode Washington's coattails, and he won, becoming the president, only to see his rival and the close second-place finisher become his vice president. Although both men received a lot of votes, the sectionalism in the U.S. was clear. The northern votes overwhelmingly went to Adams, and the southern votes overwhelmingly to Jefferson. Adams entered the White House in an incredibly difficult situation. He was tasked with following the great George Washington and was clearly elected under partisan circumstances. Jefferson and Madison both openly refused to cooperate with him and worked behind his back to undermine his presidency, which was crazy considering Jefferson was in his cabinet. And by the way, this whole scheme that Jefferson and Madison had to undermine his presidency, I have a Patreon bonus episode on that if you'd like more detail. It's really interesting stuff. From the fall of 1797 through the spring of 1798, things became really sticky for President Adams. Tensions with France were high, and in order to avoid conflict, Adams sent 3 commissioners to Paris to negotiate peace. Unfortunately, these Americans were met with contempt, and the French intermediaries even went as far as to demand a bribe for them, which is like the ultimate diplomatic insult. This bribe was just to speak with the king, not to even accomplish anything diplomatically. These 3 French intermediaries, who were referred to as X, Y, and Z in the reports back to the American people, became the primary subjects of the ensuing XYZ affair. When word got out, the American public was furious. They wanted blood, and many pushed President Adams to do something about this diplomatic insult that the French just lobbed our way. In order to prepare for what was bound to come next, the Department of Navy was created, and the pieces were carefully being put into place to fight if it came to it. The size of the army was tripled, and Washington was put into command, with Hamilton as his number 2, something that John Adams was furious about being coerced into. This is also a topic I have a Patreon bonus episode on. In the Caribbean, American ships were waging an undeclared war on French ships, and a conflict that became known as the Quasi-War, and it seemed like everything was pointing toward a war with France. Adams was under increasing pressure by the Federalists to get involved in a declared war, and he became more and more concerned with the rising political tensions. The Federalists jumped at the chance to take advantage of war fever and the drama of the moment. They passed 4 pieces of legislation through Congress aimed to suppress political opposition from the Francophile Democratic Republicans and ensure their long-lasting dominance. Referred to as the Alien and Sedition Acts, and signed into law by Adams in the summer of 1798. These were the worst fears of the Democratic Republicans coming true right before their very eyes. These laws empowered the federal government to deport foreigners from countries at war with the U.S., expel any alien resident Adams suspected of subversive activity, and extended the citizen requirement from 5 years in America to 14. The citizenship requirement extension was particularly frustrating considering that if you weren't a citizen, you couldn't vote. Therefore, Congress and Adams were essentially delaying the potential potency of their political rivals for another 9 years, because most immigrants coming into the U.S. Sided with Democratic Republican ideas for government. The 4th law that was passed, the Sedition Act, may have been even more egregiously partisan and seemingly unconstitutional. But remember, though, at this time, the Supreme Court power of judicial review, which is their ability to determine legislation constitutional or unconstitutional, had not been established yet. So The Democratic Republicans were in a bit of a tough spot. Legislation could be passed by Congress that you could clearly point out to be unconstitutional, but nothing could really be done about it. There's no way to effectively challenge the constitutionality of a law. The Sedition Act said that you couldn't engage in a conspiracy against the government, which on the surface seems pretty fair, and could not print, listen to this, anything, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious against the government, which today, if that were true, would put a lot of people out of business. And the reason this is such a problem is it clearly violates the First Amendment's right to freedom of speech, right? Not only this, but the Federalist-appointed judges who had heard the cases seemed to be very partisan in their decision, with 10 men convicted for crimes, which makes sense because all of these judges were put in place by the Federalist-controlled Congress. Jefferson and Madison had had enough. They penned the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, hiding behind the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures to ensure their anonymity. These directly challenged John Adams and the Federalist Congress, and these laws that were passed. Madison and Jefferson introduced America to the concept of nullification, arguing essentially that if the federal government passes a law that is clearly unconstitutional, such as these, then each individual state should have the legal right to declare that law null and void within its boundaries. And it makes sense, right? What they were arguing is that, when we as states ratified the Constitution, we were agreeing to be ruled by a federal government that operated within the bounds of that Constitution. If all of a sudden the federal government starts passing laws that are clearly outside of the bounds of the Constitution, then why would we have to follow them? We ratified the Constitution. We didn't agree to do anything and everything the federal government told us to do, especially if it violated that Constitution. This is not the last time we'll hear about nullification. While Jefferson and Madison didn't really get other states on board with this idea, Southern states will latch onto this in the antebellum period leading up to the Civil War to oppose federal legislation that threatened their slaveholding rights. With tensions at an all-time high, some high Federalists, or Hamilton lackeys, viewed the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions as a public conspiracy to overturn the government. Some historians claimed it even went as far as rumors of Virginia seceding from the nation or taking up armed resistance against the Federalists, which, for obvious reasons, would have been a pretty big deal. While these weren't imminent in any way or serious threats, the pressure to do something about France and French influence in the U.S. was very real. With the Federalists expecting war at any moment, and their war fever helping them win elections in 1798, it seemed like the natural next step. This is where John Adams committed his most proud act of his political life. Not caving in to political and social pressure from his fellow Federalists, Adams reopened negotiations with France. Adams chose country over party, something that I have always respected him for. He sacrificed his own political future for the betterment of the American people, so hell yeah, he should be proud of himself. That is what being a leader is all about. With the Federalists no longer being able to label Democratic Republicans as traitors to the nation, seeing as Adams himself reopened negotiations, they lost their best political argument leading up to the election of 1800. Democratic-Republican organization and messaging were superior to the Federalists as the election approached, and they had a more popular candidate in Jefferson. It also didn't help that Alexander Hamilton, the leader of the High Federalists, was trashing John Adams, the Federalist candidate, publicly every opportunity he got. And when you take a step back, this sort of makes sense. Because when you think about it, not only did John Adams avoid war with France, weakening his own party and limiting the power of men like Hamilton politically, but he also took away Alexander Hamilton's opportunity to lead the U.S. Army in war. Because let's be honest, the reason he was going to be Washington's second in command was so he could be the de facto first in command when Washington inevitably was too old and tired to do the job. In the election of 1800, which historians lovingly refer to as the Revolution of 1800, which we covered in episode 91, Jefferson defeated Adams, Although Adams was able to secure peace, word didn't get back to the electors prior to them casting their ballots. For the first time in American history, the most notable example up to this point in world history, the balance of power changed in a nation through a peaceful and democratic method. The baton was handed over from one great American to the next, and no blood was shed. In a short period of time, the United States of America was proving itself to be a trailblazer in more ways than one. Next week, we'll get into the second part of this review, Unit 4, Part 2, in which we'll cover Jefferson's presidency, Madison's presidency, the War of 1812, and preview Unit 5. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.